Thank you, Mr. Annan. That was extraordinary. We have just under half an hour for questions, and I'd like to open it up to the floor and to the web audience, so I'll start off with just a couple. But let me get straight to the point on Syria, which you spoke passionately about, and you mentioned a poisonous mix. Does most of that poison come from within the region or outside the region?
Both. I think we should look at it in three circles. The inner circle, the national situation, with the divisions amongst the opposition, the Assad government's position, and the crackdown of something that started as grassroots movement for a say in how the government is managing its affairs. And then you have the region. The region is divided. You have countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, firmly with the opposition, to some extent the Gulf states. And then you have Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah with Syria. So the divisions are quite deep within the region. And of course, you have the international community, the outer circle, which if they had been able to come together, stayed united and maintain sustained support to try and get the region working together, we may have been able to contain the crisis. But that has not happened. So I think the problem is in the region, but the paralysis in the Council has compounded the problem.
Do you believe global unity is enough to overcome those regional and internal divisions? In other words, if there was a global agreement, that would overwhelm?
If there was a global agreement that was genuine, where the parties were committed to it, and we're going to put pressure on countries with influence to change their attitude on the ground, it could have. I mean, you would recall at the beginning, I came up with a 6-point plan. And everybody kept saying, this is the plan, the only game in town. Lots of lip service. But nobody really went. I went to all of them. I said, you have influence. I asked the Russians and the Iranians to work with the Assad regime to pull back. I asked Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others to work with the opposition and try and contain the situation. We even forced the issue and came up with a ceasefire on the 12th of April in 2012. On that day, all the guns went silent. Even Al Jazeera said, we can't believe it. Nobody is shooting, which indicated that someone was in control and that they could stop it if they wanted. And if there had been real support from supporters of both sides, I think we could have seen a bit of a difference. The international community, if they come together and work together with the Russians and the Americans and everybody and put in sustained pressure, it could make a difference. You also need to bring in Iran. There are those who say, I won't sit with Iran, I won't sit with that country. You cannot have choices if these countries have to be part of the solution, and Iran has to be at the table.
Does Russia have enough influence over Iran to bring it in and sway it?
What Russia has said, and they told me, is that we cannot do it alone, and we would want Iran also involved, that they cannot pull back President Assad alone. And honestly, that's a sad situation today. Unless they work together, they cannot pull back Assad, nor can the West manage the relations with the opposition or pull back the opposition. Yes, they've gone and recognized a Syrian national coalition. They've been given the Arab League seat. They have an embassy in Qatar. And yet when you talk to them, those who took these decisions, they would also agree with you that the opposition cannot run Syria.
Mm. You talk about international will, but really it's Russia and the United States. I think you've made that point. The Americans seem to suggest quietly it's the Russians who are being difficult, and I was in Russia a year ago and they emphasized, no, it's the Americans who are being difficult. Who's being more difficult?
Let me start.
Please don't say both.
No, I'm not going to say both. They are not listening to each other. They are talking past each other. They are talking past each other, and in a way, the West felt they had an easy run. The Chinese and the Russians were blocking things in the council. So you can say, if it weren't for them, we could do this and that and that. The Chinese and Russians are blocking us from solving the problem. One question I asked them, if a year ago, or even today, the Russians and the Chinese were to say, we have no problem, you handle the situation, what would they do? And so this impression that if it weren't for the Russians, the issue would have been is strong. The Russians' attitude was, yes, we have no love for Assad, but to say Assad must go without offering giving any idea of what happens when Assad goes, are we aiming for a chaotic collapse? So the attitude, let's try and put something in place before. For example, I gave you indications of what happened in Geneva a year ago. Once the two sides had agreed that you need a transitional government with full executive authority, normally you should be halfway home. You should focus on that and discuss how do we create that transitional government with full executive authority, and how does Assad fit in? That in effect implies he's on his way out. When does he leave? The West at that point was saying Assad must leave first, ab initio. He has to go because if he's there, we cannot reform. And the Russians were saying if he goes up front, you're going to cause chaos. Could they not have sat down and discussed how long would it take to set up a transitional government? 3 months? Would you, Russia, and others agree that once the transitional government is set up, we can work together and find a way of easing him out? This is the way I would have negotiated, rather than pointing fingers at each other and calling each other names. That's not leadership.
It doesn't seem, given the last 10 or 15 years of international experience, there's any magic way to get, especially dictators, out of a country. Do you have any insights from your experience on what works and what doesn't work in convincing someone to leave their power base?
I think normally one should work with the people of the country. And it's always best when the people themselves decide to get rid of the leaders in the country. Don't tell me, look at North Africa and the Arab Spring, because they know their society and they know how to manage a change. Change has to be managed. One cannot just create a vacuum, remove some, say we've improved the situation. Sometimes it gets much worse. And what we are seeing in North Africa is going to take a long time for it to be resolved. But at least it's something that they initiated and they are dealing with. Outsiders going in and trying to change regimes and remove government can be a tricky business. And it can lead to unexpected consequences, and we've seen that.
Is that something that you would suggest should never be considered?
No, it depends on, never is a bit too strong. There are times when you have to take action. It's a bit like saying, should force never be used? There are times when it is necessary. For example, a perfect example is when the UN and the international community went in after the first Gulf War to get Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. That was absolutely necessary, legitimate, and got lots of support.
The region around Syria is arguably the most difficult in the world to reach an agreement on almost anything. In your experience, what did you learn about bringing very different and disparate parties together in the Middle East?
It's not easy, and it's not pleasant, and it's tough and hard work. And there are deep suspicions and mistrust. At the same time, for decades, there were arrangements that brought a sort of stability and calm in the region. And so it is not entirely hopeless. but there are no easy choices or shortcuts. And it takes very, very hard and sustained work. You've seen the Middle East, the Palestinian, Israel, and how long it has taken. And my own view is what we are witnessing in North Africa and the Arab awakening is more of a revolution that would take 10 to 15 years to work itself out rather than the a year or so that we tend to, time frame that we tend to look at. Change takes time, change has to be managed, and it's not always easy to manage it. And so some patience and wisdom will be required. I recall when I started a reform at the UN, when I became Secretary General. In about 6 weeks, somebody managed to get an article in New York Times that the Secretary General has not reformed the UN yet. And usually I had a monthly lunch with the Security Council, and that was the day. So when I went into the room and had to make remarks, I apologized to the council members for my failure to reform the UN and its agencies in 6 weeks flat. Sergei Lavrov, who is today the Russian foreign minister, was a Russian ambassador then, and perhaps the only communist in the room. But he was the one who quoted God. He looked up and said, "Mr. Secretary General, what are you complaining about? You've had more time than God had in creating the world." So I said, "Mr. Ambassador, I agree. But God had a unique advantage. He worked alone." And without a Security Council.
Is that the secret? Get rid of the Security Council?
No, we can make them work better. But I leave it to others.
I'd like to open it up to the floor, but just one last question on the UN. Is it more or less effective today than, say, a decade ago in dealing with sectarian conflict?
I think first of all, the world has changed, and the attitude of governments has also changed. We've gone through years of assertive leadership from some countries to almost withdrawal and hesitation. U.S. was very assertive in those years. Today they are standing back and really do not want to overly assert. Their allies want action, but they don't want to lead the action themselves. And the UN reflects these tendencies in capital. The UN can be as strong as the members want it to be and as much as they support it. UN has no forces, has no troops. It borrows them from governments. If governments are not ready to go in or do something, the UN cannot do it. And so I often try to get people to think of the UN in terms of two United Nations. The United Nations that is made up of the member states will sit in the Security Council or the General Assembly and give orders to the Secretariat to carry out, and the Secretariat which carries out the orders. Sometimes the way the media handles the UN, they talk of the UN as if it's some satellite out there, and it gives the member states a pass. Instead of saying we need leadership from President Putin, from President Obama, and they talk of an amorphous UN as if the UN can just take action. So it is very important.
I think a hand went up over
and
there.
I have several UN ambassadors here. They would agree with me, I'm sure.
Kofi Annan, I wonder if you could help us in that if Plan A is the primary parties in the region, the Security Council, the big players finding a solution, what about a Plan B? For those of us who are not the primary players, who are on the secondary or tertiary row, For example, in this audience, you have some politicians, I hope, civil servants who advise them, but you also have myself and others from the United Nations Association, NGOs, and we can sometimes work with the government, sometimes with the public. But what should we be encouraging people to think about for Plan B? It is not a solution. What are the things that we have to be considering that we're going to need to be done to help the people in Syria?
Let me say that on some issues, it is possible and relatively easy to come up with a Plan B. And I think the constituencies and the people you've mentioned in your question have really been very effective in certain Plan B situations, whether it's a fight against poverty and the Millennium Development Goals, the ban on landmines, the establishment of the criminal court. Without the support and the action of civil society and others, we wouldn't have them. When it comes to an issue like Syria, which is a hard, tough issue, we need to be coldly realistic and accept that the parties that have been fighting for 2.5 years will only bend to the will and the pressure of the powerful countries. I don't think the Plan B that you're suggesting is possible, nor are there countries that are ready to step in and do what one expects the Russia and the US working together to do. There have been suggestions about sending in an army as peacekeepers from Arab and Islamic countries. I don't think that is an option. In fact, that may even create its own problems. And so, for the moment, I don't see a solution that will not include action from the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the others. You need them.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. If there's any hands, there's microphones traveling around. Yes, sir. I think up front here on the left, if there's a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very insightful remarks and to accepting the pillars that you've outlined and the importance of the political. I'd like to ask you about matters of the human spirit. If you could comment, where do you get the strength when things look at their most dismal, the strength to go ahead in a spirit of optimism and to keep persisting? And can you talk about times when there's been a change in an almost unpredictable kind of way, but where people in a significant way have changed their position, and what might have led to that in perhaps some unexpected ways?
Yeah. No, I think in this business you have some successes and you have some setbacks. And there are days or nights when it looks really dismal. And I'm optimistic. By nature, I'm an optimistic person. And if I have a good night's sleep, I wake up the next morning even more optimistic. And I always tell people you have two types, the pessimist and the optimist, but the optimists always die happier. But on a more serious note, let me say that however hopeless the situation seems, you need to hold on to that little glimmer of hope, that little glimmer of hope that makes you feel that you may be surprised, you can make a difference, you can and may be able to turn an individual around. I mean, I recall when I was going to speak to Saddam Hussein, going to see Saddam Hussein in February 98. I woke up early and I was going to catch the Concorde to go to Paris and then continue from there. There were journalists outside the house, which never really happened. And one of them asked, Mr. Secretary General, do you have the stomach to take on Saddam Hussein? And I dismissed. I said, what a silly question, and jumped into the car and left. He made a story out of that. He got a story out of his question and my answer, which was fine. And then when I went to Saddam and we talked and discussed the issue, it was a question of opening up his palaces. People said he would never do it. For the inspectors, the Americans suspected he was hiding weapons of mass destruction in the palaces, and that he should open it up and let the inspectors go. He felt this was a real insult to the nation and his national pride. So he refused to do it, and the Americans were going to go and bomb. And I thought it was so crazy that you refuse to open your palaces and you subject your people to it. So I decided to go and talk to him. And not many people thought he would budge. But he did. And actually, he opened up the palaces. The bombing was put off for about 10 months. But later on, something else happened. And I sat talking to him. In the middle of the conversation, he said, "Excuse me, I have to go and pray." And I said to myself, if he prays, then probably there is hope. I may be able to get through to him. And when he left, I turned to the interpreter and whispered to him, "Am I getting through to him?" I said, "Yes, yes, yes." If you had listened and said nothing, I wouldn't even attempt it. And there are times when you feel a bit discouraged and say, what's all this? What's the purpose? How come those who've given you the job, who've given you the mandate, are not there to help you, to speak up, to do? But you continue. And the next day you learn to understand the nature of the game and the fact that there will be setbacks, but it shouldn't put you off. You have to keep going. But you also have to be coldly realistic in what you're doing and have a sense of humor and laughter at yourself too sometimes.
What did he say when he returned from prayers?
We continued the discussion, and in the end I got what I wanted, but I don't know whether it was because he prayed or he went and asked for courage. But he did decide to open up the palaces. Excellent. Which was the essence. Yeah.
I think we've run out of time. Thank you all, but Mr. Annan, thank you especially for this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.